Hello everyone, today we talk about the late Roman onager, right? A very interesting topic for a number of reasons. Ancient artillery is sort of underrated or at least sort of underexplored topic for a number of reasons. Of course, the secondary importance of these weapons, even in the actual context of siege warfare where they were primarily employed. There was actually an open field use of artillery, which, especially as a medievalist, and that more or less ancient and medieval technology up to some point were comparable in terms of mostly average performance. Of course, the Middle Ages had quite different things and purposes. Think about the trebuchet, medieval castles, etc. But the root concrete sort of basics were the same, right, in many ways. At the same time, there is also a scarcity of information regarding these pieces of artillery that, at least for the ancient world, we get, if we are lucky at some point, in some more in-depth terms. We know fairly a lot about the Hellenistic torsion catapults that also the Romans ended up adopting in some ways. Telling the truth, and I made a video explaining this, the one about the Gastraphetes and early artillery. It's actually the Romans who, for the first time, are sort of at least documented in history using such catapults, such early artillery, provided by Hellenic military engineers, telling the truth, but still finding employment in 4th century BC and eventually spreading, of course, in practical purpose at a bigger scale in the main Hellenistic powers of the time. Just for saying that, even the concept of technology, the idea that the Romans themselves had, for example, of literally stressing the notion of difference with other peoples, even technologically wise, to prove that they were innovators, that they could close gaps, etc., is paradoxically something that is used in an anti-Romanist propaganda by people who have issues today, but that actually stems from the same Roman saying that they made up for cultural reasons that we can't quite simply digress on now. Why the late Roman onager? Well, in part because this type of artillery that we will describe in technique performance today, it appears, in fact, in this later period, something like in the 3rd century. It's not like AD we're talking. So it's not like they did not exist before, but we do not know about them, right? And there are all reasons that you can't sort of understand. Also, if you look at naval warfare, for example, we talk about late antique naval warfare, when, for example, the bigger fleets, in fact, of classical antiquity shrink. It's a bit like with the legions, right, with the Vixillationes, etc. So basically, the larger stone torsion catapults of the previous centuries that are at least the most famous pieces, as it is also for the Middle Ages, for example. Like, we know sometimes of the details of this monster artillery, like massive trebuchets, etc., but we are hardly ever told in depth about all the enormous plethora and proper quantity of machinery that was routinely accompanying armies, not just, in fact, built during the moment of the siege or something. So there is all some important technical aspects we'll surely cover in greater depth also for the Middle Ages, and for areas of transition, like, in fact, the late antique one could be. Right. So the onager was a torsion-powered, single-arm, stone-throwing siege engine, emerging as a cornerstone of late Roman artillery, bringing to the supplantement of the two-armed lithobolos, which means literally stone-thrower in Hellenic, between, in fact, the mid-3rd and the mid-4th century AD. Right. This timeline is not random, because we're essentially starting with the crisis of the 3rd century and ending roughly towards the crisis of the Constantinian army system, right? So in 28 years, that would be the Battle of Adrianople, and so some further contraction, this crisis of the Roman state and military to an extent. When you look at late antique or so early Byzantine warfare, you realize that, especially in the latter, there was apparently a great deal of technological innovation, which is not strange because moments of crisis actually push you to innovate, right, to find more effective solutions. If anything, the most important backdrop to this is the need of change, like the adaptation to different circumstances, just like even the improvement in the construction of ever bigger catapults had been in a moment of growth of civilization. And that, however, at this point heads towards essentially a shrinking of the same size and role of artillery. Why the onager? Because this would become essentially the most important, the most average form of artillery that we see around during this period. Right. It should be, first of all, pointed out that the two-armed lithobolus, like the ones that is described by Flavius Josephus during the siege of Masada, etc., was incredibly expensive, right? We look at that as like the monster deck arrays. I'm preparing a video about that, by the way, and other gigantistic, hypertrophic, like exaggerations even at the time. Think about Demetrius Poliorcetes, the ruler and inventor of so many of these pieces that, however, was also marked by a terrible misfortune in warfare, including siege warfare. Most of this artillery was employed of enormous size. There is all an Hellenistic legacy that we can appreciate at this point in the Roman military from quite a while. That, especially when the Roman Empire shrinks towards the sort of what will become, in fact, the Byzantine, and so mostly Hellenic basis of its military as well, would take on characters, features that in some ways were even more reminiscent of that Hellenistic mentality. Again, not necessarily in the practice, because again, it's the same moment in which this artillery was shrinking, but if anything, in manuals, in military theory. So much so that we see again this Byzantine treatise speculating at times on this machinery. It's something that goes on also in the later Byzantine period that the Arabs in part adopted in their scientific, technological, explanatory texts, right? So sometimes it's difficult to distinguish the reality of warfare from the sort of the theory of it, and how much could this space. We were talking about this recently also as far as medieval artillery is concerned, because when we see also a major development in that, it's incidentally the moment which, for example, ancient Greek texts are being revived with the Byzantine refugees coming to the west, and so a reinjection, a bit of that Hellenic mindset regarding the hyper-sophisticated weapon that, however, we see in like in the same clash between Roman and Hellenistic powers that did not really bring to a great deal of result, like armored elephants, sighted chariots, these incredibly powerful machinery. It cost a lot and were surely part of an incredibly structured military, but that the Romans bit with sort of other means, but also adopted and in some cases improved technologically wise. So this is another era. And the first documented appearance of the onager is in Ammianus Marcellinus' Res Gestae, so we are in the 4th century, Res Gestae 19:7, precisely, detailing the onager deployment during Constantius II's Persian campaigns, right? So against also enemies of a certain civilizational development, and in a frontier that was particularly fortified, like even again, especially this local development. We're talking Mesopotamia, also the Caucasus, etc. So very difficult terrains were mostly siege warfare because of larger settlements and or impervious orography, so to say, obliged to say siege warfare. Consider that the same Sasanians in their military, in their coming to power, in their military reform, so to say, it was meant to imitate the vestige of the Achaemenid Empire rather than the previous Parthian rule. Were said to have finally developed an artillery worth of this name in the Persian world that otherwise was ridiculized, especially during the Parthian period, because of the steppe bias and the apparent scarcity and incapacity properly in siege warfare, thanks to Roman turncoats that had allegedly taught the Persians how to build this stuff. Actually, it can be anecdotally true. I mean, single Roman turncoats would have existed in that sense just as much. We can think that, I don't know, Roman cataphracts at a point were a product of some Iranian turncoating. Nevertheless, also because, as you know, the Sasanian state was truly becoming a state and trying to be centered not much in feudal Persia, but in statal Mesopotamia. And so capable of putting together forces that were tired, more concentrated, more dangerous for Rome than, for example, the Arsacid ones had been. There is archaeological evidence from Atra that, as you know, led in this essentially Syrian Mesopotamian frontier, of a two-armed stone thrower buried under a collapsed tower destroyed by Sasanian forces around 240-250 AD, marking the obsolescence of early designs, but also the proof that up to that point, those kind of more sophisticated torsion engines were still used, especially for, in fact, settlements of that size that really required, as we will see now, greater punching capacity. In fact, this is a bit like the problem that while we do see, for example, the onager developing at this point and becoming more prominent, we understand that the previous artillery types, especially the bigger ones, were fading away, but we do not precisely know how long they actually remained. Also because the underpinning, say, not just technology, but just the practical purpose that they could achieve, with also within the limits of the time, were basically always the same, right? So it's a complex topic, both technologically and economically, so to say, because at the end of the day, the result, like the range, what could be overlapping in terms of this machinery effects, was pretty close, right? But there is a reason why these designs shifted, and we'll essentially try to explain also why this today. The onager's development reflects thus a Roman response to evolving siege warfare demands, driven by also the generally difficult time, the intensified wars with a renewed Persian Empire under the Sasanians, and also these kind of fortified barbarian, but not so much barbarian, strongholds. We should point out that this was happening in the same way from the Sasanian side, right? And we do not actually see a big deal of more sophisticated engines from the other side, on the contrary, but it's as if all these other peoples had adapted to it. Say the Germanic tribes would have really not used artillery. We know that up to this later time they would have used some kind of siege machinery, and surely they would have used catapults themselves at some point, but their greater deal was mostly like man-to-man fighting, very often also to mask the fact that they couldn't afford much of a engineering background or logistical system to endure, for example, a major siege or whatever. But they would actually learn to do that. They would actually learn to use onagers specifically, but this is the important point. The Roman military remains the gold standard for everybody involved, and when even these powers manage to technologically gap the Roman one, which is also something that, considering the overall technological potential of the time, was also relatively feasible by a regional power without many problems. They, of course, used basically the same type of artillery and siege machinery, right? Remember this, because for what I was saying before, for the Middle Ages, we have a much clearer picture, given the much wider amount of documentation that there was so much out there in terms of siege machinery on a regular basis, right? It's not even true that the Middle Ages was sort of more, say, polyurcetically or siege dominated than Antiquity. Antiquity mostly documents things in a different way. You don't get. It's true that they were less politically fragmented systems, but they also talked about more crucial engagements. That were mostly the Greeks and the Romans were fixated with a big showdown, larger battles, etc. However, when we study more or less how also the Roman Empire had conquered the world, etc., we realize that in the sort of down the line of the local military operations, etc., there was, of course, an enormity of sort of frontier type of warfare, skirmishes, a ward war, so to say, and smaller, by the way, sieges and confrontations. Drawing on historical accounts, modern reconstructions such as Sir Ralph Payne-Gallwey's and also strategic principles from the time, from military manuals, also from other traditions, we try here to provide this broader analysis, an exhaustive examination of the onager's technical specifications, tactical applications, logistical complexities, and historical significance, so situating it within the broader transformation of ancient military technology and late Roman strategic doctrine. So the onager's design, as we've seen, marked a significant departure from the two-armed lithobolos, which relied on dual torsion springs to propel stones via a sling or cup. The onager, named for the wild ass due to its violent recoil, right, as we'll see now, this bed that the arm smash into it, so it's just like a mule kicking in the back. Utilizing a single horizontal torsion bundle, typically sinew or hair, which was also, by the way, the same actual one used for any other torsion catapults with bigger engines that were very difficult to find. You don't just find random Asian woman's hair, because that's literally what they needed for the same level of elasticity, etc. That's also for the people who still believed that Hannibal could march on Rome and besiege it after Cannae. My eyes, all right? And that's a reason why he didn't do that. You're not more intelligent or capable than Hannibal, in case you ever wondered. Mounted, by the way, in a robust wooden frame, you can see from the picture here. So the arm, drawn back by a winch, released energy to hurl a spherical stone projectile. Of course, like, different projectiles could be used, but mostly it was just like a stone be thrown through a sling, amplifying velocity and range. Right? The spherical stone projectiles, of course, for this type of throwing, own a particular type of aerodynamic and mostly effect homogeneous, like balance. And other stone projectiles, especially also the older ones, the ballistas type, because the actual meaning, the actual term used was catapult, right? That stemmed from the old etymology of piercing through the shield, right? Kata meaning through, and pelta is this shield, right? But it came to encompass this broader set of engines, and the Romans had other terminology. And here, by the way, we call it onager the Latin way, even though, of course, we're looking at a world that was tendentially ever more Hellenic speaking, at least in the later centuries. This is not much of an issue, but always remember that it's mostly like a historiographical vocabulary evolving later, attributing the name, because there would have been other names that we're not fundamentally aware of and or may have been used in different ways. In any case, you understand that this is a pretty compact, reliable, solid type of artillery. Exactly what the bigger one, ballista style, had not been. Right? This is not to say that this earlier catapult types would not continue to be used. They would always be used throughout the entirety of the Middle Ages, in part even the early modern age. But they were tendentially smaller, right? And or were often not so sophisticated as the top exemplars, let's say, of, in fact, this Hellenistic or also Roman early imperial time. The point, as you understand, just like more easily to the extreme of the Dark Ages, so to say, is that you don't really need to use a very expensive and sophisticated torsion engine catapult to besiege a moat, right? There are other ways to storm it. Actually, the onager is the reflection of this, because it's less smashing, as we will see now, overall. Consider, however, there was a lot of different smaller fortifications that this artillery was much better suited too, and not just in the, say, for smaller fortresses in general, but all the kind of complex fortificatory systems that existed at this point. Think about the notion that sort of defense in depth spread at this point the most. If anything, there was a process of fortification. Think about Rome with the Aurelian walls that are a great extreme. They would have better been stormed by the older type of artillery that still likely existed. But the fact is, here we're talking also smaller powers, provincial ones of usurpers, the same federati on the frontier, etc. That, of course, requires a more agile, cost-benefit ratio wise compared to the previous larger artillery, much more convenient, smaller ones. That can be also easily exemplified just by the proportion. You see also in medieval artillery, for a monster trebuchet, you would have had not just many smaller trebuchets in greater number, but also a plethora of greater, again, smaller machines. And in this sense, it's not really or simply proportional. The number of the smaller machines was exponential compared to the bigger ones. So the point being that even in previous centuries, for one of those big catapults, there had been many other smaller machines that we, however, can't fully see. And this is completely normal because, as we will explain now, also operationally speaking, everything, especially in siege warfare, happened step by step, right? There wasn't such a thing just like, I don't know, in Total War games, you bring the big guns, you tear the walls down, and you get in with your army. Everything was much slower, and artillery was mostly used for supporting operations during the assaults, and especially for the more sophisticated and precise, in fact, catapults of the Hellenistic era to smash specific structures like, I don't know, towers. And so actual nests for smaller catapults that were there, as well at Similia, right? But even just as a force, and the reloading times that are obviously the bigger catapults could not be not even remotely, not just of course a decisive factor, but not even just a broadly relevant one for the actual moment of the assaults that were very much concentrated and synergic with this kind of weapons, but in a sense mostly just concentrated on the assault troops themselves. This is valid for the onager as well. So the onager, as in a sense, splits down forces, economizes them, redistributes them in a more cost benefits effective way, but that also remains fundamentally. It remains throughout the entire Middle Ages. Even early gunpowder artillery was very slow to reload. They had mostly this accompanying function, so to say. Now, the aforementioned Payne-Gallwey's reconstruction of the onager, informed by ancient texts and experimental archaeology, calibrates a 10 mina onager to essentially launch a 10-pound, that is roughly 4.5 kilos missile, suitable for targeting wooden palisades, ships, because this stuff was also employed in naval warfare, and increasingly so in this type of smaller machinery. We talked about this in our videos about naval warfare in general, or enemy siege engines as well. The latter function, as we've seen, was a thing, especially when these engines were nested in certain fortifications and they required bigger artillery, but just like in later times, artillery versus artillery was considered mostly a waste of time of some sort, as opposed to the hammering you could do, the suppressing fire against, say, certain battlements where, for example, I don't know, there were archers that at large were sort of, in interest of time, more dangerous, and in general speaking, more dangerous than the single artillery pieces. Now, this onager's projectile kinetic energy, in fact, was insufficient, apparently, at least for at least the major stone fortifications, necessitating heavier variants. Again, most of the deal was not really tearing down walls per se, but at most like destroying the battlements, the towers, chambers, etc. The gates sometimes, so everything also was softer, like wooden fortifications would have been increasingly frequent, right? As we were saying before, especially on the frontier and in makeshift fortifications like the field ones as well. Think about how, I don't know, like fortified camps. There are many examples of this in late Roman. In fact, they're also in barbarian warfare, from the Germans to the Sasanians, etc. Besides, it's not like all onagers were simply smaller artillery types. There were some, preferential designs. The older ballistas types, lithoboloi, were more preferred for the greatest performance, greater range, but the 30 mina onager did exist. This engine propelled a 30 pounds, so roughly 13.5 kilos stone, which is actually a lot when gaining, probably through the parabolical throw, like energy, also due to gravitational acceleration, excelling at that point in counter battery roles, right? Capable of probably dismantling siege towers entirely, shanting parapets entirely, as opposed to just, making people duck, when the stuff flew over their heads, or even just against the same structures. So of course, as we were saying before, this is true for different. We've seen it, for example, in the Middle Ages, right? What's the difference between, for example, a big crossbow and a small ballista, right? It's complicated to explain. It's just like, I don't know, the musket was historically born as mobile artillery, not as a handgun, as it would develop later. So you always have these different designs that can come in different ways, also in the way they were built. This is especially more evident for armor that could be literally of all material, but the designs were similar between one another. In any case, if you really wanted to breach, like for these massive walls smashing purposes, which still existed, I can't stress this enough. It's not like in late antiquity all of a sudden the bigger artillery went to sleep. If you really wanted to breach robust masonry, you really needed a 1-talent engine, right? We're talking 61 pounds, something like almost 30 kilos, or even, and that this was the monster engine, the 3-talent one, 183 pounds, more than 80 kilos. This is shocking, right? Delivering impact forces comparable to high medieval trebuchet, that at some point we will see with some sort of sound technical insight. Never really done it. We talked about trebuchet warfare, but not to this great extent. As we were saying before, however, the tendency in late antiquity was towards greater, better allocation of resources that prompted to the, for example, a greater distribution of artillery. That's also something you apparently see in late antiquity. Think about the Caro ballista, etc. They existed also in early imperial times. So there is this tendency of thinking, if anything, because it's ever more on a Byzantine view, like in fortificatory, and in this sense also, of course, offensive sometimes, but mostly in defensive mindset, right? The empire is under attack. There is a shift in the initiative, in the broader moral. It's just more or less things would remain the same. The Roman Empire was a bigger power, etc. But as you know, in this sense, technology reflected a certain attitude to warfare as well, was now different, either for moral or cultural, or also way more pragmatic reasons. And so that you could have monster onagers as well, but we don't see them much at this point, because we're likely less suited to the role as structures. Besides, in general, scaling from a 10 mina to a 1-talent engine involved, in general, doubling, at least, linear dimensions, yielding an 8-fold increase in volume and mass. Let's leave aside also broader logistical considerations. Let's just think the machine, which is in fact is all consistent with cubic scaling laws in structural mechanics, right? This proportionality ensured consistent torsion dynamics, but exponentially increased material and logistical demands. We know, by the way, that the ancients were particularly good at creating their own stuff. Today, of course, we have much better engineering, but with the means of the time, because they were experimented exactly with the same limitations of the era, we are not able to replicate that, right? I don't know, Caesar's bridge on the Rhine, or this other, even the actual 3 talents, ballistas, like stone shooters, like they were something extremely difficult to create, to maintain, to upkeep, etc. And we, as moderns, didn't make really a great job at replicating that. Naturally, the Romans, whoever used this stuff, was perfectly good at handling it. Here, it's not much a matter of technical achievements. We know that the ancient world was quite advanced, but just the good enough, the cost-benefits ratio, for which an enormous and very expensive military like the Roman one has to calibrate on the basis of broader political and strategic reasons, even before strictly economical or doctrinal, right? Always remember that armies change just by themselves, right? You do not really need a reform or something like these older engines would have just made room to the smaller ones that would become more typical or that likely already existed. We don't have here, we don't even make a prehistory of the onager, because there isn't in documentary form, but we don't even have this artillery at hand. But we, archaeologically wise, but we understand it would have been easy to produce also in the previous eras, right? So we have no reason to think that it was new, for example. On the contrary, we think it had always been around. So the average onager's range, typically 300 to 400 meters, approximated that, by the way, with a bolt-shooting ballista, but suffered from inferior accuracy due to a more accentuated parabolic trajectory and sensitivity to variables such as wind, missile sphericity, or not so sphericity, and torsion spring degradation, especially. The latter was basically the main problem, aside from other structural ones at large, because of the stress that especially the larger pieces suffered during operation. Breaching operations demanded positioning within 180 paces. That would be something like 266 meters, assuming a Roman pace of essentially 1.5 meters, to achieve a low angle trajectory and concentrate impacts within a 1-2 meter target zone. There were different ways you could use, of course, the stuff. There was also an early sort of bouncing, policy to that, having this stuff, these balls rolling into the enemy ranks sometimes, because again, also in open field they were actually used, but mostly, right, the practicality, the cost of it was relegating these artillery pieces to siege, primarily to siege warfare. By the way, if you look at the distance from the enemy, this 266 meters, the crews, you realize, would have been exposed to enemy bolt shooters, which fired 1 to 2 kilos iron-tipped bolts at something like 60-80 meters per second, or also long-range archery, with composite bows achieving effective ranges of 150 to 100 meters. So this was normally calculated in a synergic effort where more or less you could, you wouldn't just send the artillery out there to be shot at, but you would essentially approach, especially in siege warfare, with all a series of field fortifications and counter battery fire. And also in open field, we will make a video about especially late Roman warfare, sort of offensive and say defensive fire power that entailed like all a series of pretty thick, in fact, missile barrages at very different and increasingly overlapping distance depending on how far the enemy advanced. Counter battery support from lighter ballista or protective mantlets was surely essential, aligning with the obvious security deriving from an advantageous position would have been chosen and manned and operated through coordinated forces. The onager's firing rate further limited its tactical flexibility, but considering the static realities also of siege warfare, it was perfect really for that. It had been mostly designed for that type of context. So if you were to make a fire rate, you can imagine a 10 mina engine discharging once per minute, a 30 mina every 5, and 1 talent every 10 minutes. Besides, projectiles were not infinite. There would have been some grinding fire during pretty long sieges that did not entail assault in close time intervals. In fact, these intervals reflect the labor-intensive process of winching the arm, loading precisely crafted missiles, and recalibrating the torsion bundle, which require, of course, skilled engineers to maintain optimal tension. Something like 5 to 10 kilonewtons for a 10-minute engine. This would have not happened repeatedly unless the machinery was already well pointed towards the enemy target. Could somehow just remain in position and exploiting that. This is also how later trebuchets were ever more focused for. Of course, the smaller the artillery, the more mobile this wasn't, because possibly this also the smaller the target. And so, given the behavior of the enemy, sort of more necessary the movement of the piece of artillery. But stones were not infinite, and yet most of this intense bombardment would precede or actually occur in parallel to the assaults to the fortifications, and most of the more attritional phases of a siege that could last for months, for example, would witness much more scarce and isolated attempts also to, in fact, calibrate the shot, but also to catch the enemy by surprise a certain degree. So there would be all means to mostly mask the same artillery and or the operating crews. Torsion springs prone to fatigue and moisture-induced degradation necessitated frequent replacement, which was, as we've seen, basically the greatest problem, because at least wood was mostly available. The same stones were available. There were some craftsmen in the army properly dedicated to provide the shots with an adequate shape. At some point, you would also shoot sort of rougher pieces. This is something that's seen happen also during the Middle Ages. At times there were very organized armies that brought prepared shots right on campaign from, say, royal arsenals, and sometimes more often than not you would have also for smaller powers random, and just also for logistical, and at some point it was just a mere, again, cost benefits calculation, practical purposes, rocks found around, right? But this is not really a repetition fire. You don't need that in the tempo of those actions unless you have put together lots of those projectiles for a very intensive bombardment that is basically happening in parallel to the storming of the fortifications. In any case, the onager was, regardless of its greater simplicity compared to the ballistas, still requiring specialized maintenance. It was very expensive. Artillery was fairly expensive, or even very expensive overall compared to other just even military units in general, and its purpose was naturally connected to sort of speed up the siege process rather than anything else. Besides, logistical demands were formidable in of themselves. Like a 10-mina onager required a crew of 10 to 15 men, including winch operators, loaders, and engineers, with larger models scaling to 20-30 personnel. This contrasted sharply with bolt shooters operable by 2 to 10 men, highlighting the onager's manpower intensity. Of course, the bolt shooters were sort of mostly operating smaller engines by this point, so that's also the issue. The bigger ballistas required basically the same amount of crewmen. Mobility was another constraint, as we've seen contextually. It was normally not a problem because, again, this artillery was just employed where and how the same constraints brought it where it was. And if these weapons existed, it was obviously because there was a purpose and a positive to them. Oxen capable of pulling from half to a ton at 2-3 kilometers per hour transported smaller engines intact, but say 1 talent and 3 talent monster models were often disassembled, requiring reassembly by the Fabri, that is to say the military engineers, proficient in torsion mechanics and carpentry. Especially the spoon, like the arm of this artillery, was, like for the trebuchet later, was the more delicate part that was usually preserved because it required this very specific type of construction and qualities also of the material, etc. Whereas the frame could easily be assembled or even created from scratch in different ways, right? So it's obvious that the bigger pieces especially required some transportation. Bruce transportation was just more cost-benefit effective because you would have a much greater firepower that you had to ensure to be able to wield there. Sometimes, of course, it may have been easier to, depending on the time available, building it on the spot. But in general, armies traveled with siege engines. And so even that's how in open field clashes this stuff would be actually used, because it was there and it was often also carried next to for example, the ammo for archers and stuff like that. So as we've seen, these engines required some fire support protection to be operated, and that firepower was also better concentrated. So there was probably a much more dynamic tactical employment of this artillery also in open field. And during siege warfare, it was pretty obviously like that as well. Missile production posed additional challenges, of course. Spherical stones hewn to tolerances of, say, more or less 2 centimeters by skilled masons ensured aerodynamic consistency, but demanded significant labor, estimated at 1 or 2 hours per 10-pound stone. Against non-stone targets, irregular stones encased in baked clay sufficed, right? Fragmenting upon impact to prevent reuse, a tactic that has also to do, of course, with a general principle of disrupting enemy resources. Clay-encased missiles weighing 10 to 15% more to do the casing. Reduced range by 5 to 10%, but were faster to produce, requiring only basic kilns. Of course, these logistical burdens, like for artillery in general, tethered the onager to fortified bases or well-supplied siege camps, limiting its utility in rapid campaigns. There were also, however, smaller onagers that could be more easily transported, maybe not on an expedite march, but still, in ways, it's not like a contemporary mortar in terms of cost-benefit capacity. destruction and like weight, etc. But again, think about the Cairo ballistas. Those were definitely mobile artillery that was conceived for this more, again, adventurous role that was definitely used in not just in open field, but against enemy fortifications in raids, skirmishers, and so on. Tactically, the onager was primarily a siege weapon optimized for static engagements against fortified positions. Its role in breaching walls, demoralizing defenders, there is a psychological component attached to this. At the end, also relatively contained destructive role in neutralizing enemy artillery nests aligned with Roman and ancient, in general, siegecraft traditions, as seen, for example, in Trajan's Dacian Wars or Julian's campaigns against Ctesiphon. I made a video about that, not in a strictly strategic sense, but of course we discussed there. Most, in fact, was based on cavalry, infantry. We'll come back on that as well, however. The onagers are rare use in field battles, such as at Cremona, that was a form of artillery in 69 AD, during the year the four emperors demonstrated its capacity to devastate massed infantry as well. This is, again, especially from a psychological point of view, an underrated aspect. Just like artillery, even in, in linear warfare, it was actually still, as already in this era, like the least lethal arm by, say, absolute, like in the army at large. In the total tolls, right? Most people were killed during the pursuit with swords, spears, right? However, like having, a projectile, a sphere, like 10 kilos, smashing to your lines, like maiming, like especially in the thick, thickly packed formations of the era, like killing people in horrifying way, could be also like mind-blowing in terms of just imagine the honor, the mystique of a warrior taken out like that. The Romans stressed this, for example, when they impaled some Germanic chieftains with ballistas shots, right? They had inherited two trees, for example, in Germania. They had inherited a bit of that Hellenistic flavor to the story, right? Of saying, look what we can do even without having to send another Titus Mallius Torquatus to kill this barbarian, right? So there are different times, but this stuff was actually, I think, imagine, if you watch Gladiator, the first scene, it's sort of culturally inspired to that concept, like the Romans turning the Marcomannic forest into some sort of napalm bombing scenario. But the actual effects would have not been that different. And of course, they had a very heavy psychological impact. Like we know that the barbarians were actually stunned by this because they had really never seen them, or at least they had seen them, but not very much like straightforwardly used against them. And so there was a level of if these guys, so it was not even about the weapon or the damage that it caused, but it'll say if these guys can use this kind of weapons, if they have, because they were very often, as we've seen, too expensive at the end of the day. It would have been technically easier to employ more, for the same cost, more soldiers, more cavalrymen, more infantrymen, even just light troops, etc. But the fact that on top of it, the Romans could use this stuff, and also with monster catapults, like, again, at the Siege of Masada or in other circumstances, really showed these enemies of Rome that Rome was beyond. With this artillery was the cherry on top of a military that already those other peoples could not afford, and that could even on top use this kind of fireworks, so to say, right? Tacitus, Histories 323 describes a battalion onagers projectiles crushing Flavian ranks with a 30-pound stone at 50-60 meters per second, delivering kinetic energy, something we can estimate in 22 to 26 kilojoules. Sufficient, as we were talking about before, to kill or maim multiple soldiers per impact. It would have been easier at this point with formations of mostly 8 in depth, or sometimes even more depending on the multiple files at closer range than hitting Napoleonic infantry lines, right? And that's why, in a sense, it would have been actually more frequently used in this context than we imagine. However, the onagers' immobility, mostly slowing firing rate, as we've seen, and vulnerability to cavalry or skirmishers even, restricted its battlefield role, right? So there is always a caution there, especially considering how costly these machineries were, and also just the specialized expenses for the crews, etc., against rigid reliance on specialized assets in fluid contexts. In sieges, the onager's effectiveness depended on integration with other forces, as we've seen. Bolt shooters suppressed enemy artillery, while sappers and ramps exploited bridges, essentially harmonizing diverse elements to achieve victory. The onager's psychological impact, shattering walls and raining debris, further aligned with the purpose of undermining enemy morale, which is, Clausewitzingly speaking, not quite the ultimate objective of war, but something close to it. We'll have to explain this a bit more in depth another time. And you understand easily how in siege warfare there is a great pressure, a great compression, right? I don't talk much about these things, but I'm actually one of the few military historians on the square, so to say, that has actually studied in-depth siege warfare, not just and also actually open field engagements of the smaller type. So very often we neglect this. Most historians just stick to the bigger engagement, and so they also look at, like in this case, artillery in the bigger, more documentable sense. But it's often even from secondary information, details, etc., that you get a more nuanced picture of the world that actually enlightens you about the full exploitation of everything possible, and how all these elements worked in tandem in again, like instruments in a big orchestra, right? And that none of these weapons, for example, none of these arms were actually employed just for the sake of themselves, right? And or even just of some vague sort of synergy, but actually a pretty thickly locked one during the greatest moments of the heat of the engagement, right? So again, not to say that, again, Gladiator is a historical document or that it makes much sense from a military point of view, but that idea that you would have to shock and awe the enemy in certain circumstances was really very similar to what you see there. And then other things that are ridiculous, telling you the truth, from the thick cavalry charge formation in the forest to just the ridiculous formation, the solution in the first moments of the engagement. Later on, that's another story, but in a sense, there is some of that. Thus, the onager's technical evolution reflects Roman adaptation to the strategic challenges of late antiquity. In the 3rd, 4th centuries, so intensified frontier wars with Sasanian fortresses like Nisibis and Germanic Oppida demanding heavier artillery, or at least in a time where Rome could simply use deterrent force by assembling these enormous weapons together with enormous forces. Nobody would basically stand against Rome, right? Gradually, not just these other peoples Romanized and became thus more performing from a military point of view, but they passed on the offensive. The Romans were fighting against each other, but there's a broader political and strategic crisis at different points, like the one of the 3rd century, like the later ones that occurred especially in the late 4th, where armies required sort of better distribution of resources, very often like more stretched resources, that thus favored this more capillary distribution of firepower that could not be used simply in a resolutive, deterrent, or simply destructive fashion. Bring it to smaller, more compact and reliable, enduring artillery as well, right? The major ballistas, and the one talent, for example, more, were just erected in front of the enemy fortification. It was just it, right? Some of this continued happening in late antiquity, but you find also different adaptations, different technologies. Stuff that was also just easier to use, and so to modulate for a greater amount, like for a greater distribution among forces as well. Everything has a specific function, a specific bend. It's like, as I was saying in the beginning of the video, think about the vexillationes. It's like they didn't exist, by the way, in previous Roman times. The detachments had always been there. But now the need for having massively concentrated legions, legionary forces permanently stationed just at one point of the limes, with uniformly qualitative heavy infantry served by peoples that, just in virtue of that deterrence, would simply support them in the sort of dirtiest jobs, like the auxiliaries, were no more, right? The same Roman military specializes itself, because everybody has become Roman, right? There's a level of gentrification, a level of individual impoverishment. Things are not particularly better on the other side of the frontier, but in this sense, there is a much greater hatred and struggles, etc. And so things become more intense, they consume more resources. You can see how the end of late antiquity is the end of this sort of overstretching of resources for all peoples involved in this. That brings to this more economic approach that, however, is also pretty stretched as far as like the relative terms of the various years are concerned. The same goes for massive ships and massive fleets supporting them. That also ends, there's a more maneuverability, less reliance, for example, of ramming. I've seen this also in the videos about naval warfare, because ships weren't even that too big or having that underwater effect rams to basically just smash heavily into the enemy bigger ships or hulls underwater, or in the smaller ones. There is a greater need of maneuverability, of adaptability. This is reflected also in artillery, right? The onager's torsion technology, inherited from Hellenistic catapults, was refined to deliver greater energy density than traction-based engines. This is also very, very important, because it was more compact, right, in relative terms, and essentially sinew springs generated something like between 10 to 15 kilojoules per cubic meter, compared to human muscle 0.1, right? So it really meant a lot. It was that sturdily effective, just like the actual onager, the ass animal, and it really pulled it off, like the humble mule in that sense. So in a wilder, also wilder fashion. It's designed thus prioritized modularity, allowing field adjustments to torsion bundles or arm length as well, but required a robust engineering course at the same time, as evidenced by Vegetzius' De Re Militari 422, which emphasizes the ballistari as well, that we'll discuss in another video, especially for the historical military unit type, but in general also in more conceptual terms. So again, when we look at topics like this, we realize that we know relatively few overall in terms of like the more conventional knowledge about this type of artillery, and a more again in-depth documentary evidence on how this would be employed. We can, however, get it through like the history of polyursatics in ancient medieval times. You understand now the dynamics that essentially underpin the natural change towards this type of artillery that would remain for an important amount of time. It would be other sort of simpler forms, for example, of trebuchet coming later, that would be thus also relatively less, even more cost efficient in a sense, but for early medieval fortifications that were in fact not requiring even the onager as far as its torsion complexity was concerned. Like just pulling strings with muscular force, as you understand, is cheaper in relative terms. It also is less effective to some other degree. It's like how the counterweight trebuchet would, for example, evolve later on as more enhanced, responsive for different targets compared to the ancient ones, right? But at the same time, again, if you were to confront the essentials of all these artillery types, you would find that they were actually pretty similar with one another in this sort of, think about some mangonels, other type of catapults that existed in the Middle Ages, how similar they were themselves to the ancient ones. And so this is sort of very fascinating, and it's difficult to simply make comparisons because from one side the technological insight tends to distinguish, right, and the same historical one tends really to provide with a different documentary evidence and historiographical interest. But the essentials were really very similar throughout the two millennia. And again, we have to probably look better at also ancient artillery to core, as we have already done already at some point. They're really moving the first steps. We have really to talk about the more complex type of catapults, like of siege engines in general. And here, in fact, for the history of artillery, I had already made a video about the onager. It was one of the very first in Schwerpunkt's history, so to say. And I don't remember whether it tackled many of these. We talked about Roman artillery in general from the 3rd century BC to the 4th century AD, so that's a comprehensive approach to the war. We already talked about the Roman onager in general, right? This is more like the later onager. I wanted to emphasize this later aspect by however pointing out how the onager was already there, right? And therefore how we could and should think of this specific artillery type as something way more common than just something spawning for some no reason in this army's roster for the end, or say for late antiquity. That's not quite, again, what would happen. I hope that also the level of technical details, just by example, by average, as far as we can reconstruct a bit through experimental archaeology, reconstructions, reenactment, etc., can give an idea of the physical strengths involved, because we also have an idea of, especially looking at firearms, that this technology was incredibly primitive and sort of ineffective, etc. But if you understand how, compared to human muscular force, really how powerful this artillery was, you also understand why it was used and against which targets. That we always have to imagine, this is valid also for arms and armor, etc. Were always designed ideally, but that in practice would be also lower quality and against targets or enemies that were of also lower quality, that good enough, that fundamentally is to be found in warfare, not just through that cost benefits ratio in part, yes, but also for reasons that derive from shortcomings that have really not much to do with the technical performance. Again, all these weapons, all these technologies exist, they are what they are, not much because of a pure technical ideation, right? Otherwise, there would have not even been, if you don't have a context, you can't adapt the type of weapon to it. And the context is heavily spoiled by things that have nothing to do even with tactics or strategy, but maybe logistics, maybe, again, politics, and just the context of the time. In fact, you see that in every war, things are adapted and sort of to the circumstances, even probably in the type of employment. It's also fair to say, again, that given the simplicity of these technologies, are fairly simple. So they are also crafted for a type of warfare that, as we said, was not, again, undergoing in absolute terms radical shifts. Just were very important, but in relative terms. And so also technology, as you understand, it's not like it evolved dramatically or even evolved dramatically for that matter. Just this is also a bit the matter for the following centuries. Not like in the early Middle Ages, they didn't have the technology, right? Something had been forgotten. Of course, the level of continuity for sophisticated torsion engines, just out of practicality, had been interrupted, but maybe just on the market, not in the theory, and thus also not in the practice had they actually needed to employ it. And probably we would be amazed to see how even barbarians, say, didn't actually systemically use this, but would adapt, like especially in those federated contexts, etc., of hybrid, to these kinds of technologies, like by using also Roman forces in the territories they control, etc. And then we know that more or less this ended by the mid-6th century, which is also fairly late in time, when, again, it's not like it was plenty of artillery around, but still were pretty impressive machinery, pretty impressive military engineering, properly deployed. Right, look at the Gothic wars also from the Byzantine side, even in a moment of radical material poverty, telling the truth overall. Like, again, also pre-industrial societies were not particularly rich to begin with, also in more prosperous times. So as you understand, it's always a labor limit of some sort. You can't say too much, but you can also grasp that it's exactly for that scarcity of information that we can appreciate how relatively smooth all this process would have been, and so how more prepared we have to be for some sort of more comprehensive view, and especially the contextualization of these weapons in the type of operational, tactical, and logistical, strategical context that they were called to absolve, right? Again, this is just, again, one of the videos we will make on ancient artillery. We often talk about artillery, and to me it always feels like it's too technological. Actually, armies relied on different substance, but we also make lots of videos about other stuff, so that it's good. And this stuff actually can help to attract people who get more into these topics, to see objectively how there are more important things, or at least more important things to consider, other than the, generally speaking, technologistic bias that revolves around normally this interests. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.